Hilchos Shofar v'Sukkah v'Lulav Perek Sheni. The laws of the Shofar, the Sukkah, and the Lulav, Chapter 2. Today we are focused on the Shofar. First three chapters of this set of laws is about Shofar, then the next three about the Sukkah, and the last two about the Lulav. It's fascinating. Today's Rambam is being studied this year, 5784, on Shmini Atzeret. So of course it's being pre-recorded. We're not recording it on the holiday. But mystically, according to Hasidic teachings, the 48 hours of Rosh Hashanah are mirrored by the 48 hours at the end of the month of Tishrei of Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. And it says that whatever is accomplished on Rosh Hashanah through seriousness, through bitterness, through the avodah, through the divine service of teshuvah, of return, the same thing is accomplished during the 48 hours of Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, but not with a down energy, but instead an up energy of celebration, of simcha, of joy. So it's fascinating that this year in the Rambam we're studying the laws of Shofar on Shmini Atzeret. In other words, the interplay between Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the month of Tishrei, and Shmini Atzeret, the culmination of the month of Tishrei, is found in Torah as we study the laws of Shofar on Shmini Atzeret. So I thought it's just hashgacha pratit, divine providence, to point that out. The topic of today's chapter is going to be dealing with who is obligated in the mitzvah of hearing the shofar, and the extent to which one Jew can help another Jew fulfill his or her obligation by blowing the shofar for them. We're also going to talk about children blowing shofar, and we're going to explore the laws relating to blowing the shofar on Shabbat, which was particularly relevant this year as Rosh Hashanah fell out on Shabbat, and we did not blow shofar, and we'll see more about that today. So without further ado, let's begin. Halacha Aleph. Hakoil chayavin lishmaya koil shofar. Every Jew is obligated to hear the sound of the shofar. Kohanim, Leviim, v'Yisraelim. Whether you're a Kohen, whether you're a Levite, whether you're a regular Israelite, a regular Jew. V'geirim v'avadim mishuchrarim. Whether you're a convert or an emancipated, a freed slave. When a person becomes a slave of a Jewish person, he becomes obligated to fulfill mitzvahs on the level of a woman. And then once he's emancipated, he becomes a full-fledged Jew and is treated like any other Jewish man and liable and accountable and obligated in all mitzvahs as a regular man. Aval nashim va'avadim muktanim, but women, slaves, and children, p'turin, are exempt from the shofar. They don't have to hear the sound of the shofar. Mishe chetzei eved v'chetzei ben chayrin. Somebody who is half slave and half free. That means he's owned by two partners. And one of the partners freed him. So now he's half slave and half free. And the name I like to use for the chetzei eved v'chetzei ben chayrin is on the screen, a split personality. We're going to develop it a little bit later. The Torah actually views this person as having two elements simultaneously. There's a part of him which is a slave and is to be treated as such, exempt from the mitzvah, and there's a part of him simultaneously at the same time, which is a regular Jew, obligated in all mitzvahs. So first we're going to talk about his obligation vis-a-vis himself. A person who is a chetzei eved v'chetzei ben chayrin, a person who has this split personality, he's half slave and half free, v'tumtum v'androgynos, as well as a tumtum and an androgynos. These are, and I'm going to get maybe into a little sensitive area here, although it's not really sensitive from a Torah perspective. Tumtum and androgynos are both purely biological phenomenons. Tumtum is somebody whose gender cannot be ascertained because his reproductive organ is not visible. It's covered by a layer of skin, so we do not know which gender this baby is. Is it a boy or a girl? Now, not we don't know in essence. Technically, we could discover the answer. If we were to cut away the skin, we would know if there's a male reproductive organ or a female one. But in this current state, he is a tumtum. Tumtum means stuffed, blocked. The skin is blocking the area. Androgynous is a hermaphrodite, a mix of both genders in that he has both reproductive organs, both the male and the female. So it doesn't get into the whole idea of gender dysphoria, gender ideology. We're not even going there. We're not even going to weigh in on that. This is purely biological issues. A person who we cannot ascertain whether he's a male or female, either because the area is blocked or because both organs are present. So the Rambam says all of these three types of people, chayavin, they are, again, vis-a-vis themselves, obligated to hear the shofar. In other words, let's go through each one. The person who is half slave and half free, we have to look at the part of him that is a free, full-fledged Jew and obligate him to hear the shofar, because on that account. The person who is a tumtum, we have to assume that perhaps he is a man. If we were to unblock the skin, we would find the male reproductive organ, in which case he'd be liable to hear the shofar. The androgynous, the hermaphrodite who has both organs, we have to look at the male reproductive organ and say, therefore, he is treated as a male and obligated to hear the shofar. Now, that's all as it relates to themselves. What about as it relates to others? So the Rambam says, Halacha Beis, Kol mi she'enei chayav badavar, einei moitzi es hachayav v'dei chivasei. Anybody who is not obligated in a mitzvah cannot fulfill the obligation for somebody else who is obligated in the mitzvah. Lefichach, therefore, right off the bat, the simple application of this halacha is Isha ekatan shetaku b'shofar, a woman or a child who blew the shofar, hashemea mehen lo yotza. Anybody listening to them cannot fulfill their obligation because the woman and the child themselves aren't obligated. So how can they fulfill the obligation for a full-fledged male who is obligated? Now, what about the other three categories who are really obligated, but if you think about it, there's a doubtful element to their obligation. Androgynous, a hermaphrodite who has both organs, moitzi es minoi. We can only allow him to fulfill the obligation for somebody else of his type. Another androgynous. But he cannot fulfill the obligation on behalf of somebody who isn't his type. In other words, a person with only a male reproductive organ. Because in that case, we're going to have to force ourselves and say, perhaps we should look at the hermaphrodite's female element and consider him to be a female, in which case she is not obligated in the mitzvah of shofar and cannot fulfill the obligation on behalf of the male. But if it's another hermaphrodite, then we treat them as their separate category. This is like neither male nor female, it's another element of gender. And so within their own world, they can fulfill obligations on behalf of each other. Tumtum, on the other hand, the person who is blocked, he cannot fulfill the obligation on behalf of anybody. A fellow tumtum or a regular male. That's because if the blocked skin of the tumtum were to be ripped open and unblocked, there's a 50-50 chance that it'll be either discovered to be a male or a female. So on the chance that he's going to be a female, even if it's a fellow tumtum that he wants to fulfill the obligation for, we have to assume that perhaps that tumtum will be discovered to be a male. And a female cannot fulfill the obligations on behalf of a male. Certainly if we're talking about a full-fledged male, the tumtum, on the assumption that he is a female, cannot fulfill the obligation on behalf of the full-fledged male. And again, I stress, we're talking purely biologically here. The Torah is not weighing in here on gender issues. Purely the biological phenomenon. Gimel, v'chein, misha, chetzi, eved, v'chetzi, ben chayrin. Similarly, the person who has the split personality, he's a half a slave and a half a free person. Einei moitzi afilu atzmai. He cannot fulfill the obligation even on behalf of himself. She'ein tzad avdus shabai, moitzi tzad cheres shabai. Because the half of him, the part of him, which is enslaved, cannot fulfill the obligation on behalf of the part of him that's free. In other words, when he blows the shofar, we're going to look at it as though two people are blowing the shofar simultaneously. One of the people blowing the shofar is a slave, and a slave cannot fulfill the obligation on behalf of a free person. Rather, how should a person like this fulfill his own obligation of hearing the shofar? He has to listen to another free, full-fledged Jew to blow for him. So he is obligated by listening from somebody else, but he cannot fulfill the obligation for anybody else. Dalid hamisasek bitkiyas shofar lihislamit. Somebody who occupies himself with the blowing of the shofar simply to practice. Lo yotze yadei chevasei. He, in his own blowing, has not fulfilled the obligation of his mitzvah. As we're going to see, the shofar requires active intent. You have to be aware of and conscious of the fact that you are doing a mitzvah. If you're simply practicing blowing the shofar, you aren't doing a mitzvah in your mind. Similarly, the person who hears the shofar from somebody who's simply occupying himself for practice and blowing for practice cannot say that he fulfilled his obligation. What if the person listening is having intent to fulfill his obligation by listening, but the person blowing the shofar doesn't have in mind to fulfill the obligation on behalf of that person? He may have in mind to fulfill the obligation for himself, but he isn't thinking about that guy. Or the person blowing the shofar does have in mind, hey, I want to fulfill your obligation for you by you listening to my blowing. But the person listening doesn't have in mind. he hasn't fulfilled his obligation, until both the hearer and the person causing the sound to be heard, the blower of the shofar, have to both have in mind. This is why today, in most shuls, you will hear the person who blows the shofar will announce before, have in mind to fulfill your obligation, and I will have in mind to fulfill your obligation on your behalf. Hey, Misha Taka, kol kiyase. What if somebody blows a shofar and he has in mind that anybody listening to me should fulfill their obligation through me? He doesn't have anybody specifically in mind. It's simply a general thought, a general meditation. Anybody listening should fulfill their obligation through me. And somebody did indeed listen and indeed had in mind to fulfill his obligation. Even if the blower isn't actively having in mind that particular individual who is listening to his tekiah, to his blowing, he doesn't even know him, he fulfills his obligation. Because the blower had in mind anybody who would listen. Therefore, a fascinating halacha emerges. If somebody was walking on the road or sitting at home and passing by the shul, or from his home, which is next door to the shul, he hears the tekiyot, the customary blowings of the shofar being blown by the leader of the congregation, he fulfills his obligation if he had in mind to fulfill his obligation. By default, we can assume that a leader of a congregation has in mind to fulfill anybody listening their obligation on their behalf. If the holiday of Rosh Hashanah falls out to be on Shabbos, we don't blow shofar in any place. Even though the only problem with blowing shofar on Shabbat is rabbinic. And therefore logic, and even Jewish law logic, would tell us that you should blow the shofar. The biblical commandment, the positive commandment in the Torah, should override a rabbinic enactment. So why indeed do we not blow the shofar on Shabbat? It's a decree. Perhaps somebody will take the shofar in his hand and bring it to somebody to blow for him. Everybody knows that they have to do shofar, but not everybody knows how to blow the shofar. So he'll have a shofar at home that he won at some Chinese auction or something, and he'll bring it to a local friend or a rabbi who knows how to blow the shofar. And in the process, he will transfer the shofar 4 cubits in a public domain, or carry it from a private domain to a public domain or vice versa. And he will come to the hands of a death penalty prohibition. Carrying on Shabbat is liable to the death penalty. In your eagerness to do the mitzvah, you will end up stumbling and transgressing Shabbat. Everybody is obligated to hear the shofar. Not everybody knows how to. So we'll go find somebody else to do it, and that will cause them to transgress the Shabbos. The rabbis were worried about this, and therefore they said no shofar on Shabbat. Now, of course, it's quite curious. The commentaries discuss it at length. Come on. Who are we talking about? One person? Everyone's in shul. Of course, the rabbi will know. He'll make sure nobody carries. And for one guy, we're going to push off the mitzvah for everybody else, even the greatest of the righteous. And it's one of those places where you really need the Hasidic insight to fully understand the halacha. The Alter Rebbe, the founding Rebbe of Chabad, taught in his magnum opus, Likutei Torah, that the rabbis, they give legal reasons because everything has to be vested in legalities. But the truth of the matter is that there's a mystical reason for why we don't blow shofar on Shabbat. And that is because whatever the shofar accomplishes is already accomplished by Shabbat. The Shabbos itself does whatever shofar needs to do. And so there's no need for the shofar. Not a prohibition. The legal prohibition was like a dress-up, a costume for the real thing. The real thing is that the Shabbos replaces the shofar. That's a Hasidic understanding, which gives a much more wholesome appreciation for this halacha. Zayin hatinoikos shelo higiu lechinuch, children who didn't reach the age of education. They aren't even 6 or 7 years old. Ein ma'akvin esom militkoya b'Shabbos she'eino yom tov shel Rosh Hashanah. We don't stop them from blowing the shofar if they have a shofar, toy shofar, and they want to practice on a regular Shabbat, not Rosh Hashanah Shabbat, a regular Shabbat during the year. We don't stop them from blowing the shofar. Kedei sheyilmadu, so they should learn how to blow the shofar. Umuter legadol sheyisasek imon kedei lelamdon b'yom tov. It's even permitted for an adult to deal with them and teach them if it's a holiday, not Shabbat. On a holiday, you can also teach them. Bein katan she'egia lechinuch, bein katan she'lo egia lechinuch, whether the child has reached educational age or not. Shatkiya ina asura lemishum shvus, because the only prohibition stopping blowing shofar on Shabbat is a rabbinic one, and for kids, we're not concerned about that. Ches, says the Rambam, a large caveat to this whole shofar on Shabbat thing. Kishegazru shalilit koya b'Shabbos, when the sages decreed not to blow shofar on Shabbat, loy gazru ala b'makim shein bei beis din. They only decreed in a place where there is no court. Aval b'zman sheya beis hamikdash kayam, v'ya beis din agadol b'Yerushalayim. But when the temple stood and the high court functioned in Jerusalem, hayu hakel toikin b'Yerushalayim b'Shabbos kol zman shebeis din yoshvin. So long as the high court was in session, everybody in Jerusalem used to blow the shofar. And the truth is, says the Rambam, v'loy anshe Yerushalayim bilvad, not just the people in Jerusalem, ela kol ir shehoisa b'seich tchum Yerushalayim, any city which found itself within the border, 2,000 amot of Jerusalem, v'yisaraya Yerushalayim, and it could see Jerusalem. In other words, lo shatia b'seich hanachal, not that it was in a valley and couldn't see the Yerushalayim on the mountain. V'yisashemas kol tkiyas Yerushalayim, and it could hear the voices, the sound of the shofar being blown in Jerusalem if you wanted to. Lo shatia b'rei shahar, in other words, that it's not on top of the mountain high up. V'yisayachel lavai b'Yerushalayim, and one could walk from that city to Jerusalem. In other words, no river stopping them. The people of that city who could observe, who could hear, who could walk to Jerusalem, they would blow shofar on Shabbat like in Jerusalem. But in every other Jewish city, they would not blow the shofar, only in Jerusalem when the high court was in session. And the Rambam says, nowadays, even after the temple was destroyed, any place which has a set, functioning high court, so long as they can trace their smicha, their rabbinic ordination, all the way back to Moses, and they're in Israel, technically, they would blow in that high court on Shabbat as well. The Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, one of the Rambam's primary teachers, was known to have said that in his time, there was a court that could trace their smicha back to Moshe Rabbeinu, and they wanted to blow the shofar on Shabbat. And even more recently, in the year 1905, 1904, Rabbi Akiva Schulzinger made the effort to blow the shofar on Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah. It was a big, big deal in Israel, and many rabbis agreed with him, many rabbis were against him. At the end of the day, he gathered a minyan of 10 people, went into a room, nobody knows what actually happened. But there has been effort to rekindle this custom of blowing shofar on Shabbat, excuse me, in a place with a high court. But of course today the accepted common practice is no shofar on Shabbat. We can only blow shofar on Shabbat in a high court which has the authority to sanctify new months, in other words, to use the calendar, to dictate the Jewish calendar, which is a very high caliber court. But other high courts, we don't blow the shofar there, even if they can prove their smicha back to Moshe Rabbeinu. And we can only blow, again, the shofar in the presence of this high court, as long as they're in session. Even if they are shuffling to get up, but they haven't yet gotten up, you can blow the shofar in front of them, in their presence. But outside the court, certainly you cannot blow the shofar. Why was this decree suspended in the presence of a court? The rabbis were worried somebody's going to carry. Why not worry in a court? Because the members of the court have alacrity. They're very careful, scrupulous in mitzvahs. And anybody blowing the shofar, even if it isn't members of the court, they'll never let them end up carrying the shofar in the public domain. Because part of the job of a high court is that they warn people, let them know how to live as Jews, and therefore they won't allow for a transgression to take place. Nowadays, which we observe 2 days of Rosh Hashanah in the diaspora, the same way we blow shofar on the first day, we blow on the second day. If the first day of Rosh Hashanah fell to be on Shabbat, as did this year, and we weren't in a place where there was a high court fitting to blow the shofar in their presence, we only blow the shofar on the second day, as indeed we did this year around the Jewish world.